Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to the IHRC conference. For those of you who are joining fresh, for those of you who are back, welcome back to the second session of the second day of the conference. My name is Professor Saeed Khan, and I shall be chairing really what looks to be a wonderful session on perceptions and representation of Muslims within the hegemon. For those of you who joined us earlier today, we took a focus on Muslims at the periphery of the West. This, of course, contrasts that because it shows the situation of Muslims who are, in fact, living within the West already, and how the shifts that are happening in matters of Western security, Western economies, Western identities, how these then are going to impact the Muslims living in the midst of all of these changes in the so-called core, if you will. A different perspective, a different set of priorities, a different set of anxieties, and a different set of challenges can certainly be seen when it comes to that particular phenomenon. We have three excellent keynotes who will be speaking, followed by two very excellent panelists as well. And then hopefully we can go ahead and have a very nice synthesis of all of these minds and voices in the Q&A session. For those of you who would like to, please go ahead and supply your questions in the comment section, and we will go ahead and address any and all of those that we can within our time frame. With that, I'd like to begin with our very first keynote, who is Laurence de Rooij. Laurence is a specialist in psychology and mental health, a lecturer in Islamic studies at the University of Chester. He obtained his PhD from Durham University, and his research examines how non-Muslim people in Britain interact with news reports about Islam and Muslims, and how that affects their interpretation and conceptualization of Islam and Muslims. And I think that this is a very important element to go ahead and examine, because not only are non-Muslims, of course, affected and impacted by the media depictions and representations of Muslims, but also how those representations and depictions are internalized by Muslims who live in the West. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laurence. Laurence, great to see you again.
Yeah, sorry, great to see you again. And thanks for having me here today. I apologize for sounding a bit croaky. I've just come out of a bout of the flu, so I'm on the mend, but yeah, my voice is still a little croaky, so I hope it's okay for everyone listening. And if there are any issues, please just ping me a message, and I'll try and uh, solve the problem if I can. So. Yeah, thanks to Saeed's wonderful introduction. And yes, he's right. My focus has always kind of been how um, non-Muslims engage with representations and imagery and Muslims themselves, and how does that kind of interplay play out, and what does that mean for relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in the West moving forward? And so, what I'm hoping. Um, I'm hoping everyone can now see my screen because I've now it has now disappeared. So, but yes, I would like to propose a slight deviation from the focus on the sort of imagery and narratives that surround Muslims in the West and in Europe specifically, and really try and propose some, I guess, solutions or some avenues for change. Like, if we look at images and aspects about how, in particularly the news media, represents Muslims and people of color, really, it's mainly underpinned by what's called news values. So, events or stories that are covered, they're picked because they are seen as a break from the norms. Everything is condensed into a sound bite or a very small part of the overall story. So you kind of get a, if you imagine an iceberg, you see the tip of the iceberg, but the larger content of the story is, submerged and hidden. And so, media companies and stories and journalists do that very well. They pick the bit they want to highlight, right? It's like a torch in the dark. You show the bit that you're able to and you want to, and there's reasons for that. But so much else in the dark room is hidden and obscured. And so what happens as a result of this is that, news reports and, in Europe and the West are, have a very long history of very biased and stereotypical reporting, and whether that, sometimes is just a bit clunky and kind of, ignorant to, on their end of the landscape. You have very sort of biased and racist depictions and quite offensive stories and images that get portrayed and shared. And now with, mass media and social media, these things go around the globe. And the various kind of controversies and moments where kind of you get a bit of a flash and a sort of incendiary moment, and there's like a big controversy, and there's protests and etc. And I don't really want to focus on that. There's plenty of more adequate experts on that subject matter than myself. Um, but what I've really been focusing on the last couple of years is how do we actually move forward? Like, how do we take all this wonderful activism and scholarship and analysis that, has a very also a very long standing history. I think in as far as, when people start to you know sort of react negatively against a certain action, you get both sort of pro and against, and that's kind of the birth of activism, right? So as long as there's been negative stereotyping of Muslims, people of color, etc., there's been activists for change and people demanding recognition. And so, but because of that long-standing history, I feel like certainly in the last few years, following things like Black Lives Matter and those kind of things have been a bit stagnant. I think the moments for change people were expecting and hoping to see haven't actually happened. And so I wanted to kind of focus on three aspects as to why that doesn't really happen. And so I want to focus on the psychological elements, the psychological processes, an organizational aspect. So how does media actually work from an organizational perspective, and how does that hinder change, and what might we do about that? And then lastly, discursive change. So look at how do we actually change those narratives and images. And so firstly, we have to think about, what are the psychological processes involved? And, it really boils down to kind of three basic elements, right? A media story that one might have relies on how that media source plays in a person's life and the opinion they have on the subject at hand and any kind of experience they might have about this. So, for example, if you read a BBC News story about, the Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, that, and he's talking about, new policies, new economic policy, how you feel about the BBC as a source, what you think about, say, the Prime Minister as a person, as well as then how, what you might think of that subject as economic policy, but also the way that that story itself is covered. Those three aspects kind of affect what you take away from it, right? Like the information transfer from the story to the person. And so that changes a lot from individual to individual, and that's what makes us unique and gives us that free scope of interpretation. And that's why when people read news reports, even you get five people in a room, they take five different perspectives on the same story, right? You know, but what you kind of want to see is a change in that interpretation, right? So that when, partly because when stereotypical news stories are regurgitated and presented over time. You would want people to have a slightly more complex and nuanced understanding and be able to place that in its position in the same way that we would like to think that when the prime minister's economic policy is revealed, people would have a sort of, somewhat educated debate and understand that, you know, tax breaks in this place and versus stimulus here and there, what is the overall strategy. And I think part of the issue people have with politics in the UK is that people can't see the overall strategy, but that's a debate for another day. The point is that people make those interpretations based on their personal identity, and we can't change that like flicking a switch or changing a light bulb, right? You can't. It has to come through that personal interpretation. So you have to create an environment or a place where actually people start thinking differently, or interpreting things in a different way. And this is where the problem kind of lies. When people are confronted by difference, and I don't just mean people of color or different, values or religions. I mean just difference. Even you see this in families, you see this at work. It's a challenge to the self. It's and it's about self-preservation, and it highlights our sort of fight or flight response. That is the fundamental biological response to change. Unfortunately, human beings are very fearful biological entity, and we don't really do well with change. It's awkward and it's discomforting. If you imagine you go on a holiday or you travel somewhere new, or even if you just walk to a new part of town, you're little, when the hairs on the back of your neck start to stand up, you get a little, that's a warning sign of like, hey, maybe I should go somewhere else, right? That's fight or flight. And what we find is that even in stories about people of color or Muslims in the West, it's that same biological response that's activated, and that makes it very difficult for people to have, firstly, a rational debate because it becomes very emotional. But also, people are fearful, and that's further reinforced by repeated stories about terror, about issues, immigration, us versus them paradigms, etc. And so, what we actually should be aiming for is this split from fight or flight to what's known as tend and befriend. And actually, in that first instance, when a person is kind of in that sort of state where they're trying to figure out how to manage change in that awkwardness and into discomfort, the response should be a very kind of tender and almost an overly friendly response. Make it super positive because that narrows the negative psychological response. And it seems really antithetical. It's the idea that, when confronted with something that's fearful, your natural reaction is to take a step back. And, and actually in that situation, if what needs to happen is to accept that that's the response, but despite that kind of scope, still take a step forward, make a positive response. And we have to create a situation where that is okay, and where it's also even just a first step being okay saying that this is hard and awkward, and people do not like talking about it, right? And so we need to, that's already the step one, addressing the issue. But then actually, in if you want to remove the psychological barrier here, it's despite that awkwardness, you still have to make a positive response, and it's training yourself over time to repeatedly make that positive step. And that's how you change the psychological process. Because historically and biologically, we are programmed to take that step back. Until we take a step forward, we will continuously take that step back, and things won't change. So that's step one. But changing the individual, it doesn't really help much if we're in this global world where we're constantly under threat. There's stories of terror, or even now the World Cup of football is going on in Qatar, and there are people, stories of migrant workers dying, and the state of Qatar oppressing LGBTQ people. And that's making the highlighting those issues, whilst important, is also further driving a wedge between various communities. And I think that kind of broadcasting can be done with a lot more nuance and sensitivity to the various parties involved. And so, but what that kind of has to do with is, the way that journalism and journalistic organizations work as a in a way, right? It's about organizational socialization is the term, the technical term. It's, imagine you start a new job. When you start a new job, you are socialized in the way of doing that job, in the team you join or the department, or and basically it breaks down to four elements. There's compliance in the sense of, can you do your job? There's clarification, as in, well, maybe if you can't, then we have to just clarify that a little bit. Culture is the more wider thing. In what way do you do your job? And if you've ever moved from one company to another, but still done the same job, you might have experienced that the culture in the different companies is just a slightly different way. So in the same way that, we see that in reporting, in the way that the BBC versus ITV or the Sun versus the Times report their stories differently. That's, culture in this sense. But it's also got to do with connection. Are you as an individual able to connect with the people you work with? And we all kind of have that need to be liked at work or to enjoy spending time at work. And so because of, if you're the new person, if you're the outsider, so you want to make changes potentially, right? This is one of the main criticisms against media corporations, is that they don't hire enough people of color. There's not enough Muslims working in newsrooms in order to promote Muslim stories or in Muslim interests within sort of Western newsrooms. And it's partly because of this. The media culture, the organization's culture, will make it very hard for people to fit in and have that connection, but they will also kind of get filtered out through the hiring process. So whilst the person they employ will probably be able to do the job very effectively, it's more on the cultural and connection aspect that they just fail. They just and even if they do make it, the sort of research and analysis that's been done of people who work in those domains, it's very challenging and can be very difficult until you become a bit established. So, but that also has to do with how the business as a business operates, and it's no longer really a business. Yes, we have newspapers, if we, but think about now, news is not, it's not about one entity, right? It's almost one person. It's, Rupert Murdoch, for example, owns so much, from Fox News to Sky News to, all these different businesses that have their own interests, but ultimately report back to one large media corporation, one parent company whose main interest is about profit and and generating value for the shareholders. And so in order to do that, they really want to, minimize the threat of new entrants, right? Well, if you don't want to have new news store or news companies, let's say, start up to provide alternative perspectives, there's two sort of very common reasons. You either buy them up if they're successful, or you crush them, right? And if you're a massive media corporation like News Corp, that's relatively easy to do. Also, because you're the biggest, if not the only game in town, you control the supply and demand, not only of stories, but also of journalists, of printers, of all the other sources. And so you control the entire industry simply because it's controlled centrally. At the same time, because you control competing outlets like Sky News, Fox News, et cetera, you can play the different angles and still generate value for yourself. So it's never really objective. It's all about just capturing an audience. And so what I would kind of recommend in this sense is that, if you really want to make change, you need to get a much sort of flatter hierarchy, and make it so that, people who do have diverse opinions have a place to speak, and are able to address not only their immediate teams and superiors, but also, all the way up to sort of C-level executives. And this has been done in a lot of other industries, and it's much and as you know and it's been seen as very productive. The other thing, and I think this would be, I think, arguably the biggest change, would be that, you know the CEO must be a former journalist. You find this in certain technical industries where the CEO must have a background, say, in R&D, research and development. And the reason being is that, understanding the technology and the reliance on that for the viability of the business is important, obviously, for a technology company. So if your main industry and your main product is journalism, having your CEO being a former journalist, understanding the job and its sort of the good and the bad, I think would really make a big change rather than someone who's a businessman and it's all about money. And I think that's also then when you're going to see more about the changes in that narrative. And this brings me on to what I was saying about discursive change. A lot of the talk about Muslims and people of color in the West is safe. Are they're safe targets? They're vastly in the minority. I mean, Muslims in the UK make up 5%, 6% of the population. So, no matter, certainly on the national level, any sort of outrage that your newspaper might cause by a certain story, you still got 95% of the population who potentially would read it. So you're not as restricted by potential outrage or alienating customers. And so again, you have these safe customers, these safe targets, these groups that you know become targets of polarizing treatment simply to sell stories, to curate an audience, and to but through that we actually the audience learns to understand people, because again, they're vastly in the minority. Muslims, like I said, make up 5-6%. So for lots of people in say in the UK, they don't encounter them very much. And so that when they do encounter people of color and Muslims in particular, people are a little fearful, maybe curious. You know how anyone, I guess, would react when they encounter something for the first time. But the way they engage with that subject of new information and that person is done through their own identity and the memories that they have. And so if that identity and those memories have been pre-formed and shaped by negative media material and very combative political discourse and things like that, then any kind of um, engagement with change or a person who is different in a meaningful way will be very, very difficult. And so to get that discursive change, to actually, how do you actually change the narrative, right? Because we try to persuade people. We want people to understand, if there's so many people who do not believe, sort of have stereotypical opinions or have racist beliefs about other people, and yet it it has been found to be very difficult to convince those who do that they are wrong. In the same way that convincing people of certain conspiracy theories is also, has proved generally quite futile, and yet it is something that we would try naturally all the time, in the same way that the they would try to convince others of their beliefs. And so, what we really, in order to actually get this narrative to change effectively in the long term, I think these three aspects, this discursive change, this organizational change, and that psychological element, need to really be done at the same time, or as much as possible. And only in those instances will it have some sort of effect. I think if we don't see that, that organizational change will not be possible if people aren't fearful of change, or because businesses are risk averse. They maybe not risk averse, they're loss averse, right? They don't want to lose money. It's a big investment to hire a new person to change the way you're approaching. And so, and so what I want to end with is, when we think about changing the narratives, how to, and integrating, Muslims into Western societies in a qualitative manner, you know, it's those are the things that are required. And unfortunately, and that is the sort of nefarious side of discourse, it is very difficult to kind of understand those elements when you are subjected to only the minor effects of it, right? And I guess, in a very sort of ironic sense, I'm always thinking of, the Netherlands' greatest philosopher, often called, which is Johan Cruyff, when one of his most famous quotes is, "You only really see it when you truly understand." And I think this is the problem. You only see the kind of nefarious and problematic elements when you truly understand how they all fit together. And so, in order to change that discourse, it is not enough to just say, "Well, we need positive representation," or the stories need to be unbiased, or because journalism logic would say, well, if any story should have two sides, but if you have 99.9999% feel one way and there's one person who feels the other way, an unbiased story would be to have both sides reflected, even if that's not how it plays out in the world, right? And so that's what I meant earlier with when I said, some of this reporting about certain issues can be done with a bit more complexity, sensitivity, and nuance. Things aren't black and white, always black and white, and things don't always have equal sides. And so, yeah, what I want to end with really is that only when you see that change in the discourse, and it relies not only on the discourse, changing the discourse itself, but also how that discourse is supported organizationally, but also from an individual level. We as people live together, not only as individuals but also in communities and organizations, and you really have to change how we relate to each other, not only on an individual level but also on that communal level, and then simultaneously change that discourse. And I think that's the challenge moving forward, is how to do that. And yeah, I would like to end it there for today.
All right. Thank you so much, Lawrence. I think this last point that you make is so vital, particularly for the Muslim communities living within the Hegemon, who may feel or are certainly perceived to live in more than one community, which then, of course, evokes multiple narratives. And especially when, as you describe with the media, how this is deployed can create a multitude of challenges. I must say that when it comes to Dutch philosophers, Spinoza, Erasmus, Grotius, and now adding to that Johan Cruyff, I think it is certainly a very fitting with the World Cup going on right now. So thank you again, Lawrence, for your wonderful remarks. Next, we will be hearing from Dr. Ian Almond, who is Professor of World Literatures at Georgetown University in Qatar. He's the author of 6 books, most recently World Literature Decentered Beyond the West. On a personal note, as I was mentioning to Ian earlier off air, had the privilege of using his excellent book, The New Orientalists, in a graduate course that I teach on Islam and modernity, and it's well received. Ian, I can't vouch for how many royalties you get from the book. It's a graduate seminar. There's not that many students. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much the story of my royalties as well. I was going to say we could share a cup of coffee. I don't think we could each afford our own cup. But through Turkey, Mexico, and Bengal is the rest of the title on that, and over 50 articles, and work has been translated into 13 languages. The most surprising language to you, Ian, of your work being translated?
Korean.
Okay.
Because I can't read a word of Korean, so it's kind of. I'm a huge sort of. Anyway, whatever.
Well, then it's a leap of faith that somebody has treated your work and translated it with fidelity. So on to you, Ian.
Thank you. So thank you for your kind words, and thank you for both to Arzu and Saeed for asking me to be one of the panelists. I'm just going to talk about. I teach world literature, as Saeed said, in Qatar, and I'm just going to talk about world literature. And it sounds a little bit tangential, but I think hopefully you'll see how some of the things I'm going to be talking about do sort of have a direct bearing on the themes of this conference: so Islamophobia, Orientalism, Eurocentrism. And I was going to talk about some of the debates that have been going on in the past 20 years around the term world literature. So world literature is a term which begins in the 19th century. Goethe talks about Weltliteratur in the sense of, this is the 1830s, this sense of a new kind of literature, a new kind of consciousness, an expanding sense of, growing sense of universality. It gets then famously taken up by Marx in the Communist Manifesto, where Marx really sort of talks about it almost like the internet. It's something which is rolling back national identities, rolling back petty provincial mindsets, and a new kind of internationalism is taking place. And then, as some of you listening might well know, in the 20th century, it really becomes almost an American pedagogical term. So in every American university now, you have world literature. It's like every single one has a world literature course as a default. And the term was sort of taken in the 90s and the 2000s by people like David Damrosch and Pascal Casanova. And a great deal of theorizing was brought about it. But what is particularly of interest for us today is some of the backlash and some of the criticisms concerning what is generally felt to be the overwhelmingly Euro-American context and parameters of this term. And because it's a series of debates which, amongst other things, has led to a kind of radical historicization amongst world literature scholars on exactly what kind of planet we live in, how we have imaged the planet, what we actually understand when we talk about the literary production of the planet. And this is really sort of where I think we come close to questions of Orientalism and Islamophobia. So, I mean, I always start out by saying the West is 10% of the planet. Yeah? The West, think of the populations of Europe and the US, 450, 300. It's not even 800 million, 850 million people together. Yeah. The non-West, Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, East Asia, the non-West is not some sort of minority that needs more representation or should be addressed. It is the overwhelming majority of the world. It is the world. And yet, even though this is the case, even though Europe is essentially geographically an archipelago along the northwestern ridge of Eurasia, what we see in terms of literature, but not just literature, in terms of history, in terms of popular culture, is often almost the opposite. We have basically the narratives and the canons of a small number of countries which continue to dominate and continue to influence. So in terms of literature, we have situations where, I mean, three quarters of the Nobel Prizes for literature were won by people from the West. We have anthologies of world literature, like Norton Anthology, in which Goethe gets as many pages as Africa, barely 15% of the anthology, barely 20%, sorry, of the anthology goes to non-Western countries. A huge chunk of it is just given to, typically England, France, US. We have bays in bookshops in Berlin where you walk into a bay, I kid you not, of Weltliteratur, and there is not a single non-Western author amongst them. We have articles like The Guardian's 100 Greatest Novels of All Time, which listed 5 novels from the non-West, and so on and so on. So we have this situation where both explicitly, but also sort of implicitly, the timelines, the landscapes of countries have continued to sort of exert a tremendous influence. Countries, geographically tiny countries, like Britain, like France, continue to exert this disproportionate influence. And what are the reasons for this? Well, I mean, there's 2 options, right? There's a racist reason. If you're racist, if you understand reality racially, then yeah, of course, sort of Europeans and Americans are basically just more creative, more intelligent, more brilliantly spontaneous than other cultures, and historically, this reflects this sort of cerebral disproportion. If you're racist, but obviously, if you're not, then there's a much more straightforward reason why the canons, the tastes, the cultures of a small half a dozen countries continue to be recycled and reiterated around the planet. And that is colonialism. What we see really is what we have is a situation whereby the former colonizing countries have successfully instaurated, have successfully installed within the colonies they freed, they left to independence, the mechanisms for their own self-mythologizing, the mechanism for their own self-perpetuity. So, whether it's half the planet going into mourning because a monarch dies, whether it's this sort of default notion of Shakespeare or Cervantes or Dante as the sort of role model for the moody romantic genius, there's a certain ubiquity, there's a certain global circulation of Western names which has taken place, and no disrespect to any of these figures, but has taken place not on the basis of any kind of mathematical calculation of merit, which of course is a conversation in itself, but on the basis of a series of colonial institutions which have repeatedly, generation after generation, continued this self-mythologizing, self-memorializing of the West. Now, when I talk like this, obviously it's not a monolithic situation. Obviously there are complexities to this. Obviously there are countercurrents. Off the top of my head, the two that stand out for me is Latin American magical realism, the extraordinary formative influence of writers like Borges, Marquez, Cortázar, Isabel Allende on the West, in particular Borges and Marquez. These are formative non-Western writers that have influenced a whole generation of European and American fiction, no doubt about that. And then I suppose another example would be Japan and much more recently South Korea. The extent to which both of these countries, particularly Japan, the post-war influence of Japanese popular culture on Western youth culture, implicitly, but then gradually, surreptitiously, but then sort of gradually, much more explicitly. These are two examples. But even if there are qualifications to be made in both of those, I don't think it's a coincidence that Japan's and South Korea's enthusiastic embrace of free market capitalism has been a factor in the ease with which they've been adopted by the West. And also, I think in the case of writers like Borges and Marquez, certainly in the case of Borges, the fact that Borges engages so much with Western authors, again, was a kind of central component in his success in France and England and the US. But nevertheless, what we find, even with bearing in mind these complexities, overall is a situation whereby a small half dozen countries essentially set the parameters for the literary trajectory of the planet. So if you're a writer from Mauritania or Burkina Faso or Paraguay or Oman, you're going to have a much, much harder job writing for an audience which has no familiarity whatsoever with the topos of your work. In sharp contrast to a writer from New York or from London or from Berlin or from Paris, or writers who already have not just a cultural context in which they work, which all writers have, but a cultural context which is quite sort of fluent, quite familiar to very, very different parts of the planet for historically contingent reasons. So this is the kind of uphill struggle that non-Western writers have, because, in simultaneously producing fiction or cinema, or they also kind of have to half anthropologize their work. They are half explaining to an unfamiliar Western reader the premises of whatever culture, whatever historical background is the background of the story they're relating. So this is why often we see this kind of filtering effect. So, it's clear that, yes, we do, in Western countries, we do read non-Western texts. But very often, those non-Western texts, those non-Western writers, those non-Western films, which are very famous, generally are famous because they appeal to a series of templates. If it's an African novel, then it will involve dictatorship or famine. Or if it's a Middle Eastern novel, there'll be some kind of fanaticism or some kind of struggle between freedom and sort of modernity and conservative religion. If it's a Mexican novel, it'll have something to do with drugs or violence. There are certain crucial components that, if, as a local writer, you insert into your text, it will augment the distribution of your text. And of course, Islamophobic discourses come into this, right? Islamophilic, which is, of course, the flip side of Islamophobia, but the flip side of the same coin. And an example, I'll just give some examples so that I'm not talking in the abstract. But I think, and I'm not dissing any of these writers here, but when you look at the popularity of someone like Orhan Pamuk, who's a great writer, but won the Nobel, Turkish writer, there are clear reasons why someone like Pamuk is widely celebrated and those reasons are not just to do with his undeniable talent, but it also has to do with the fact that he does engage in a very critical and utterly intelligent way, but he does engage with Ottoman, so Orientalist frameworks, sometimes explicitly, like in White Castle, often implicitly, but he deals with the Ottoman Empire. He deals with the prohibition of painting, of portrait painting. In his novel Snow, he deals with Islamic radicalism. These are much more immediate templates that an unfamiliar non-Turkish reader would be able to engage with. Same thing for Elif Shafak, another very famous writer. Not so crazy about Elif Shafak, to be honest, but another famous writer, Turkish-American writer, who again has Sufism, has Sufism and a certain kind of romanticizing of a Turkish landscape at the heart of a number of her texts. And when you contrast that with someone like Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, who's probably one of the greatest Turkish writers of the 20th century. And amazingly, his work hasn't been translated into English until very, very recently. But if you don't have if you don't have a decent knowledge of 20th century Turkish history, it's kind of going to be kind of difficult for you to understand a novel like Tanpınar's masterpiece, A Mind at Peace, which really deals with the kind of decadence of Istanbul in the 1930s and 40s in the wake of the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the Turkish Republic. If you don't know anything about that, that novel is going to be much, much more difficult, So these are some of the problems we have. I've got about 14 minutes here, so I'm just going to speak just a couple more minutes. But what is also worrying, I think the main thing, and I'll make this main point, there was always a big fear 20 years ago that English would dominate the planet. There was always this tremendous fear that sort of other languages would. What we've seen in the intervening years is that fear hasn't really been actualized. So domestic literatures and domestic cinemas, by which I mean cinemas in the local languages, are very, very strong. We haven't really seen sort of maybe we've seen in the learning of second languages, English has become a default language. So in that sense, there's been an effect. But for the most part, that much anticipated cultural dystopia has not taken place. What we have seen, however, is the influence of not language, but genre. It is genre, not language, not English per se, which is really doing the work of cultural influence. And because it's always, when we're talking about film noir, we're about vampire, we're talking about all kinds of different genre. Because it's in the language of the local culture, it flies under the radar of national sensibilities. So people can be watching, for example, people can be watching a reality kitchen cooking show in Turkish, or they can be watching a horror, an independent horror, or a film noir in Indonesian or in Tamil, and they won't be thinking of it as a foreign culture. They will be absorbing it, but through an optic which is crucially coming from a place which is not indigenous to the viewer or to the reader. So, I mean, those are some of the points that I just wanted to throw into this. And you know, maybe, how am I doing, Saeed? Can I just I'm at 16 minutes actually. I'll wind it up there. I'm fine. I'll wind it up there. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Ian. You know, your point, this last point that you made about genre, not language, is so vital, because as you mentioned, Pamuk. Pamuk seems to be well embraced in part because he seems to embody the Orientalist taking on Proust. And if I was in Istanbul actually last month and went to the Museum of Innocence, which is based, of course, on his novel. And again and again and again, you just hear this word Proustian being thrown around in the same way as everyone seems to have a Kafkaesque metamorphosis, you know, Proust becoming adjective after author. And again, how this then sublimates. And certainly something that we can talk about in the Q&A is the impact of Western lit on Muslims living in the West, and particularly how that acculturates them from a very young age, primary school, moving on. So thank you, Ian, both for your remarks now and, of course, your body of work. Well, next we're going to be hearing from Denijal Jegic, who is a visiting assistant professor of communication at the Department of Communication, Arts and Languages at the Lebanese American University in Beirut. His multidisciplinary research focuses on critical theory, media representations, media activism, historiography of communication, colonialism, and resistance, and lies at the intersection of media, literature, and cultural studies. In his prize-winning doctoral dissertation, he has analyzed articulations of resistance in the Global South in poetry, prose, spoken word, and rap, and he's the author of the book Trans-Intifada, The Politics and Poetics of Intersectional Resistance. Denijal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for inviting me to this conference. I really appreciate it. And what I'm going to talk about today, I would like to present you a paper that I've been working on, in which I'd like to reflect on the Islamophobic and particular sectarian representation of Lebanon and Iran, in particular in this current contemporary imperialist media discourse, which is part of research I'm working on. And I'm particularly interested in discussing hegemonic media narratives and the current exploitation of Orientalism and sectarianism in contemporary colonial media discourse. I'd like to start by highlighting a point, a situation that we can currently see in the downtown area of Beirut, in order to illustrate the point I'm trying to introduce. So there is an installation of paintings depicting the faces of the victims of the devastating Beirut port explosion, which occurred in August 2020. And some of these pictures are accompanied with the written words "Iran out," A-O-U-T. So while there is no relation between Iran and the port explosion, the aftermath of this port explosion, which has received significant media attention internationally, represented one of numerous rhetorical attempts by some to link the Islamic Republic of Iran to Lebanon's ongoing political and economic crisis. And adding to decades of negative representations of Iran in local, regional, and international political and media discourse, current developments in Lebanon that were identified as somewhat newsworthy and have been discussed in Western media have at times been framed within this context of alleged Iranian influence, intervention, and even the idea of an Iranian occupation of Lebanon. And this idea of this alleged occupation, which I'll be focusing on today, has seemingly been promoted by public officials, by a network of think tanks, media personalities, as well as native informants within Lebanon, the United States, the Zionist entity, and beyond. And in fact, both Zionist entity and US officials, as well as several Lebanese politicians, have on numerous occasions scrutinized Iran's role in Lebanon as destructive and either directly related or even responsible for the ongoing economic and political crisis in the country. I'm interested in seeing how this phrase, Iranian occupation of Lebanon, is representative of biases, stereotypes, and in fact conspiracy theories about Iran and Hezbollah, as well as Shiite Muslims in general, especially as this dissemination of this theory has oftentimes been quoted as an alleged concern for the well-being of Lebanon, and has been in fact recently promoted including by some pan-Arab entertainers in contexts that are allegedly apolitical. To some extent, this narrative has been able to penetrate at least marginally the mainstream discourse. One of the events I would like to focus on first are the protests that have emerged in October 2019 in Lebanon, when several Lebanese international political actors and media have attempted to portray the mass protests as anti-Iranian or anti-Hezbollah manifestations, although, of course, these diverse protests attracted people with various demands and could never be grasped as a monolith, with people protesting against the government, corruption, and the deteriorating economic situation in the country. Now, the fact that this was a leaderless protest that has evolved into different directions has also been infiltrated by NGOs and political parties aligned with the United States and the European Union. And here I'd like to quote journalist Rania Khalek, who in one of the earliest reports about the protests wrote that, I'm quoting, "The ideologically diffuse nature of Lebanon's protest movements leaves it vulnerable to hijacking by powerful outside actors." This journalist further observes that the US, I'm quoting again, is increasingly determined to co-opt the movement for its own goals and to oust Hezbollah from the Lebanese governing coalition, and marginalizing the Shia political military movement as a means of weakening Iran. In its place, the US and its proxies inside Lebanon are demanding a technocratic government with no interest in resisting Israel, end of quote. So if we look at this from a media perspective, what's also important to mention is that locally, according to Maruf, there was pro-imperialist liberal media and right-wing counterparts that were well prepared for this revolt, while the left was not necessarily. And this eventually led to the motto, all of them means all of them, referring to all politicians, including Hezbollah, and depicting them as all equally corrupt and responsible, was eventually adopted by progressives as well, which, as he argues, has also allowed foreign powers then to portray the protests in their favor, or local powers that are foreign-backed. Now, within this context, there have been smaller groups that have staged protests against a so-called Iranian occupation, calling the international community to intervene and even disarm the Lebanese resistance. And even though such isolated incidents have remained marginal and could be referred to as pseudo-events, which are within political communication identified as manufactured events or happenings that are staged or might be initiated for the purpose of receiving media attention, they still did receive attention from some local media that is opposed to Iran, as well as, for example, the television channel Iran International, which is based in the UK, that has reported on such an incident earlier this year. Now, adding to this creation of consent for imperialist policies in Lebanon, there have been major US media outlets that have used the protests to promote, once again, the proxy narrative about Hezbollah and Iran, which I will discuss more in detail in a bit, but also calling for US intervention through those traditional Orientalist and, in fact, Islamophobic tropes and lenses that simplify and generalize the diverse population into a monolith through, again, another discourse on modernity and progress. And in a rhetorically constructed binary of, on the one hand, US-led freedom, and on the other hand, Iranian oppression, Lebanese would then be presented as being abused by Iran and even under military occupation. There there are many examples. I'll just like to highlight a couple of examples of the representation of the protests right in the first weeks in October and November 2019. And there was one piece entitled "Lebanon Battles to be Born at Last" in the New York Times, which, for example, framed these protests within the so-called Arab Spring and used tropes of progress and modernity, while it presented Hezbollah as the common enemy. So within that article, we can find claims such as that 1 million Lebanese are demanding change, but Hezbollah has other ideas, and similar statements that clearly attempt to engineer an opposition between the Lebanese protesters and Hezbollah. And the same article claims that Iran, through its Hezbollah proxy, would still be in Lebanon. And this is just one of many examples that add to the narrative that Hezbollah, which is an indigenous Lebanese movement, was in fact not Lebanese, but installed in Lebanon by Iran. This is also one of the many examples where the freedom narrative is presented through concepts of modernity, where Iran and Hezbollah, through their opposition to the Zionist project, are considered backward and located in a intellectually inferior time and space, and according to which the Lebanese would have to free themselves from this occupation in order to advance to those Western concepts of modernity. Another piece that was published in the same time period was titled "Hezbollah had been nearly untouchable in Lebanon, but the people are fighting back," which again tries to define the anti-corruption protests as being against Iran. And this article also uses the phrase gangs of Hezbollah militants, for example, to refer to individuals associated with Hezbollah, which is another example of this demonization. And again, these are just non-exhaustive examples of a continuous media representation that identifies Hezbollah in particular and anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist resistance as the common enemy. Now, if you look at this from a historical background, consider that it's been more than 4 decades of a dominant political discourse in the West that has targeted and isolated Iran and constructed it as a common enemy. And here I'd like to discuss to what extent Hezbollah or other forms of anti-Zionist resistance are then considered as proxies of this common enemy. And here we can also think of Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model, which had identified the anti-communist filter as the 5th filter in their model, which has been used in order to create this dichotomy in political and media discourse, where a successful spread of anti-communist sentiment had led to this dichotomous framing of the world, in which there is the support for our side, meaning the West, and how this has then eventually become integral part of media practice. Research has showed that mainstream media has been less independent in the framing of issues and events related to foreign policy and security issues, and has increasingly relied on government officials to frame the news. Now, obviously, the common enemy construction has moved away, at least to some extent, from the idea of communism, and the public enemy has changed. If we think about terrorism, for example, which has been a more of a dominant term within the last 2 decades, but then also the idea of an individual common enemy, which is, I would argue, in the current case, is Iran for much of this Western political discourse. And here again, to tie this back to Lebanon, if we go back to the historical context, the reasons for the engineering, in fact, of Iran as the common enemy can be found in the late 1970s with the US loss of Iran and the ongoing focus on Iran's ideological and political support for resistance movements in the region and beyond, including in Lebanon. So the designation of Iran as a so-called state sponsor of terrorism by the United States, of course, also needs to be viewed within this context, and in fact, the very threat that Iran poses to imperialist endeavors in Western Asia. Now, this discursive construction, of Iran as a space of terror in dominant media represents, again, this perpetuation of the common enemy narrative, but also the continuous engineering and re-evaluation of the self, or reproduction of the self and the other in Orientalist terms. And as Edward Said argued in his work Orientalism as a concept can mean many things, but rather than being just a fantasy, a Western fantasy, it is also a structure and a sign of Euro-American, European Atlantic power over the Orient that has created a body of theory and practice. So what is then understood in the West as the loss of Iran has had a major impact on the self-understanding of the United States' role in Western Asia, and of course on the representation of Iran, but also on the representation of Islam in the media discourse. Also, if we look at the time frame again, there was the Israeli invasion and occupation of Lebanon in 78 and 82, as well as the following the Iranian Revolution, the organized resistance in South Lebanon that eventually entailed the formation of Hezbollah as a resistance movement that was successful in resisting against the Zionist enemy. And as Edward Said has argued in his work covering Islam in the chapter The Loss of Iran, I would like to just quote a passage from it. So Said writes, and this was about the media representation of Iranians during the time of the revolution. Said writes, however much the Iranian individual had gained his or her freedom from the Shah and the United States, he or she still appeared on American television screens as part of a larger anonymous mob, de-individualized, dehumanized, ruled again as a result. Yet whether they did so consciously or not, the news media were in fact using their powers of representation to accomplish a purpose. This did not mean principally the presentation of news, nor the analysis of or reflection upon an important new juncture in American foreign relations. With very few exceptions, the media's purpose seemed to be to wage a kind of war against Iran. And I think it's quite interesting to look now, 4 decades later, again, from the current context and reevaluate the significance of Said's chapter, which has been written in 82, and to understand this again in terms of the geopolitical reconfigurations in the region and how they have affected the representation in dominant Western media, especially if we think about the implicit dehumanizations of Iran, again, in those dichotomous terms, through this power of representation, it continues to determine the contemporary news bias on Iran. Now, coming back to the idea of the occupation of the alleged Iranian occupation of Lebanon, I'd also like to briefly discuss the realization through language in the media representation, which is oftentimes depicted through the colonial narrative, but also through metaphors. So, for example, there's been an article in a major regional media that was titled "Hezbollah will not churn Lebanon into another Iran" from 2022, that exemplifies very well those fatal dimensions that are attributed to Iran's involvement in Lebanon. And I'd like to just highlight the first paragraph in particular of this article, as I guess it illustrates those ideas about Iran and in fact the Shia population in particular. So I'm quoting, today Lebanon finds itself in the grip of an Iranian project that once again infiltrated through a sect. But unlike other interventions, this project jeopardizes the idea and specificity of Lebanon as a country. It abolishes Lebanon as the world has known it since its establishment and destroys all the features of the country, which was built on coexistence through dialogue and consensus on the entity's continuity as a hub for finance, education, medicine, trade, and tourism in the region. The Iranian project has greatly contributed to ending this hub and does not even deny it. So you can just see another construction of, again, Lebanon as the victim and Iran as the aggressor, and Shia Muslims as a sect as the invaders. And here, in fact, again, another conceptual metaphor, which I guess for the sake of time, I will not go too much into detail, but would just like to refer to the research conducted by Lakoff and Johnson, and Lakoff in particular, who has analyzed the US political discourse that was used to justify the invasion of Iraq in which the US administration has used those metaphors that where countries or states or governments are personified and constructed as neighborhoods of friends and enemies, which can be applied to the analysis of the representation of Iran and Lebanon. And the same metaphor is mirrored in numerous news articles, including one published by a Saudi newspaper titled "Welcome to Iranian Lebanon," as well as other articles and reports published by local international media, as well as think tanks. Oftentimes, such writings define Hezbollah as an Iranian, either as a proxy or even as an Iranian militia, and refers to allies of Iran as militias and terrorist groups, cautioning that there wouldn't be any stability in the Middle East unless this threat is eliminated. And this claim not only, of course, ignores the colonial and imperialist violence that both Iran and Lebanon and the region more broadly have been and continue to be exposed to, but also at times identifies Iran's mere existence as being destructive. And this proxy narrative has now become an integral part, as I would argue, of political and media discourse, claiming that Iran is spreading terrorism and that partners of Iran are alleged proxies. But this can also serve as a foundation for conspiracy theories and further anti-Iranian incitement and anti-Shia sectarianism, but it's also used as a justification for imperialist warfare, including sanctions, whereas, of course, rather than being a proxy, Hezbollah is a part of Lebanon and cannot be separated from the Lebanese population and the socioeconomic dimensions. But, of course, the proxy narrative has been used to ignore those strategic and cultural ties that have existed between Iran and Lebanon and beyond. And I think Professor Amal Saad has deconstructed this very well in a recent research paper, where she has argued that stressed that those, and I'm quoting here, that flawed assumptions that centuries-old Shia religious networks in the Middle East are the recent outgrowth of geopolitical competition between regional powers would be ahistorical, and that it erases erases centuries of cultural, social, and political ties and interactions between Shia communities. So here again, we can also conclude from this that there's a continuous dehistoricization taking place. And just a last point that I would like to mention, which I also think requires, like the other points I mentioned, more research, is the usage of this proxy narrative and of the colonial narrative for continuous racialization. And I think the emergence of the COVID virus has been another example where the proxy narrative has been used not only to naturalize colonial violence because it identifies the indigenous population or indigenous people and movements as proxies, but also deprives them of their agency and places them rhetorically outside, or their identity geographically and culturally outside of where they are actually located. And this dehumanization was again apparent at the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, when some media outlets applied again this proxy narrative in order to racialize the virus. And metaphorically, Iran was depicted as the source of the disease, and Hezbollah was depicted as a deadly Iranian virus. So, to name two examples, there was a caricature in one of Lebanon's major newspapers, L'Orient Le Jour, in June 2020 that personified Lebanon as a sick patient in a hospital bed with a physician attesting, I'm quoting, "I'm afraid you have Hezbollah," in which again we can see how Hezbollah is identified as a disease. At the same time, at one point, the hashtag Corona Hezbollah in Arabic was briefly going viral in Lebanon. And so I think this use of virological language to refer to people and movements as diseases can again be seen as a continuation of this traditional anti-Shia sectarianism and persecution as such. And in fact, an article in the newspaper Al-Sharq Al-Awsat began at the time with the lines, I'm quoting, "Some in Lebanon are casting blame on Iran, the supporter of the country's Hezbollah party, after the country's first case of the new virus was discovered on a flight from the Iranian city of Qom this week." end of quote. And then this article quotes an editorial from a local TV channel that is aligned with a party that is opposed to Hezbollah, saying, I'm quoting again, as if what Iran is sending to Lebanon and the Lebanese is not enough, so it sent us coronavirus. And just another example of a similar view that was expressed in another regional newspaper was, as an opinion piece, identified as, the title was "Coronavirus, Iran's Kiss of Death to the Lebanese," which tried to establish a connection between Hezbollah and the coronavirus by pointing out that, that the virus emerged in China, and then claiming that because Hezbollah was an ally to China, that many in Hezbollah's community were concerned because, as the author claimed, Shia would be more exposed to the coronavirus because it was coming straight to them from Iran, and then makes additional claims linking this to Syria and so on. But I just wanted to highlight those as examples how current political or in general newsworthy events can lead to different forms of realizations of this proxy narrative, of the colonial narrative, and then be again used to further perpetuate this idea or illusion of a so-called Iranian occupation of Lebanon. And again, I just wanted to conclude by just again identifying that it represents a confluence, or the phrase Iranian occupation represents a confluence of numerous Orientalist and sectarian stereotypes and biases that, again, might still be marginal, but are seem to have an increasing penetration of the mainstream discourse, and can serve to further justify rhetorically the perpetuation of colonial and imperialist and other forms of Zionist rhetoric, seizing on the current crisis of Lebanon, especially at a time where also the constructions of the self and the other are again reiterated also in the Euro-American context, as we've seen recently in the European Union with the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and his jungle and garden metaphor. And so I guess there absolutely needs to be more research and more conversations on these individual linguistic and media representations and manufacturing of sectarian, Islamophobic, and Orientalist, in fact, narratives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for some really incisive remarks. I think about the dynamic that you present coming from the Detroit area with a large Lebanese American population, and certainly the framing of these issues then plays very heavily on how it's either internalized or opposed by the Lebanese American population, which in the Detroit area, many have very close ties to southern Lebanon and certainly affinities toward Hezbollah. So that certainly looms very largely in shaping that discourse for Muslims living in the Hegemon. One has to wonder about the stickiness of these kinds of hackneyed narratives. I mean, it seems as though it's not quite the Great Reset when we're using the same kinds of rhetorical arguments of liberation and occupation from the West that we've seen for the last 200 years. And whether there's still the kind of resonance that these have, similar to what we saw last year with the Taliban, whether, as Malcolm Gladwell would say, does it have stickiness in the broader discourse, or whether, if there is a decline there, if that is indicative of, again, a sign of the West having diminishing influence. So thank you very much for those comments. We are now joined by our august panelists who will be providing comments in response to our keynotes. We have Setareh Sadeqi, who's a PhD in North American Studies from the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. She's an independent researcher and has worked over 18 years as a translator and a teacher. She has appeared as a political commentator on various news outlets, including Al Jazeera, NPR, TRT. And her interests in research include propaganda analysis, rhetoric of social movements, Iran-US relations, and sanctions. And we also have Malia Bouattia, who's an activist and former president of the National Union of Students, NUS, in the UK. She was a co-founder of the Students Not Suspects, Educators Not Informants Network, and she is an editor at the New Arab and Red Pepper magazine. Why don't we hear first from Setareh, and then we will hear from Malia.
It looks like I have some connection problems, so just making sure that everyone hears me well.
Yes.
And do you hear me? Okay, great.
Yes.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everyone who contributed to this session and actually made it easier for me to present what I'm going to present in brief about my observation of the representation of not only Muslims, but like Iranian Muslims, and with regards to what has been happening inside Iran. I'm referring obviously to the protests and the unrest that has been on Western media and on media in general around the world 24/7 for about 2 months, and how this has been also contributing to misrepresentation of Muslims and Iranians. So it has been contributing to that misrepresentation, and it results from some sort of misrepresentation as well. I think the elements of culture and geopolitical settings of Iran are very important to take into account when studying the developments inside Iran and how they are reflected on mainstream media in the West. So one thing that is I think of importance, and this is something that I have been studying before, but became highlighted during these protests, is the role of gender and ethnicity in the formation of the image of Iran. As according to the theory of international relations by Hegemon, image theory proposes a way to structure the study of perceptions in international relations. And those structural features, they play an important role in establishing a particular image of certain nations. In other words, I would say that images of other nations that can be stereotypical result from the perceived relationships of between nations, and they are exploited to justify a desired response towards that action. This is something that I think during the recent unrest and how it has been portrayed became very important. As Alexander and others argue, if attacking or sanctioning another country is not sufficiently justified, it jeopardizes the national self-image of the nation that is targeting as moral or a rational entity. So this is what the US especially has been doing against Iran, but also against all other nations that it has occupied or established some military base or sanctioned. So an image of the targeted nation as a threat or enemy should be established and promoted to vindicate any aggressive actions towards it. This is like this leads to the dehumanization. This is something that we have been seeing about Iran, especially with the recent unrest. And goal of all those images coming from Iran, and many of them actually fabricated, was to show that there was no evidence of normal life going on in Iran. So, and people are under so much pressure and they are so oppressed that they need the US to come and save them. So the majority of what we're seeing on Iran protests is aimed at producing that image. When I'm talking, like one example would be in 2019, my personal observation of the protests living here in Isfahan and in Iran and traveling also to Tehran is the 2019 protests that erupted over fuel prices going high were even more widespread, and a lot of people were killed during clashes or by security forces as they were trying to repel for example, the overtaking of a police station or dispersing protesters especially in sensitive areas. But those protests did not get anything equal to what we're seeing here. I mean, it did not get equal coverage as what we're seeing these days. And this is mainly because if you tell people around the world that Iranians are protesting over fuel prices, this is something that happens in many different countries, and it does not otherize Iranians. This is a common grievance held by nations across the world. But when you tell them that people in Iran are protesting because women are told by men to cover their head, and this is like an oppressive law that is happening inside Iran, then that's something that a lot of people across the world find outrageous because of the image that they have of Muslim and the Western liberal notion of freedom for women that they already hold. So you have an Islamophobic image, and these protests and the way they are covered add to the Islamophobic dimensions of the images that we see of Iranians and Iranian women in general. So I think it's very important to observe and to be very careful of the Islamophobic coverage of the things that are happening in Iran. We're seeing in most of the coverage is not only about the protests, but all throughout the modern history of Iran and especially after the Islamic Revolution. Whatever comes from the West about Iran is portraying Iran as an irrational actor. This is also and I think it's very important to remember that any depiction of Iran as an irrational actor in international politics consists some elements of Islamophobia, because it usually comes from an idea of an Islamist or a theocracy rather than a democratic, with all the shortcomings and problems that it might have, a democratic setting that is meant to rely on people's votes and use Islam as the basis for the constitution. So I think it's very important to remember that Iran is a rational actor in international politics, and I would recommend the Leverett's book, Going to Tehran, which is actually about how Iran is acting as a rational actor. And also, that, for example, even when the West or the Western media are talking about the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, you can see some elements of Islamophobia in that, for example, the fatwa against the use of nuclear weapons is totally disregarded, but other fatwas that can be used against Iran as a rational actor or as a normal nation are highlighted over the other fatwas, and they all aim as just with the war on terror, aim to otherize Muslims, and I see it as a part of the U.S. and Israel campaign against Iran's nuclear program, and just the way they did with war on terror to otherize Muslims. And I understand that, for example, I've seen even Muslims, even hijabi Muslim women, glorifying acts of, for example, burning the hijab as a way to protest the state. And I understand that, and I think people should be allowed to protest as long as they don't harm people. But it's very important to avoid glorifying any act that could be seen as Islamophobic to other Muslims who are practicing it, not only Iranians, but in general, Muslims around the world. That's it.
Thank you so much for your insight, Sisters Setareh. Sister Malia, the floor is yours. I think you need to, there you go.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you to the IHRC for having me, and thank you to all the keynote speakers for their presentations. For me, particularly given my work, the question of how we make meaningful change in terms of the racist representation of Muslims and other oppressed groups, how we disrupt, resist, and transform is particularly important. I think that Lauren's contribution, which offers 3 avenues for change, are very useful in thinking about the practical ways that interventions can be made amidst long-standing discussions about the media's role in perpetuating oppression and even fueling violence against groups like Muslims. For movements, researchers, and even politicians concerned with the current Islamophobia that is rife in mainstream media platforms, there are varied responses. There are some sections that believe the investment in alternative independent media, for example, is where efforts should be, and therefore abandoning mainstream spaces will allow for this to develop further. The alternative for some includes social media, which has arguably allowed everyone to be a journalist to a certain extent, or at least to believe that they have more power to disseminate knowledge. There's also the argument that those that fit into the category of mainstream media will forever be the trusted go-to to where information is sought. And therefore, the fight within these institutions is necessary for the narrative to change on Muslims and others. All, of course, are necessary. Alternative spaces, which include voices from the very social justice movements combating oppression across society, undoubtedly play a role in shaping and shifting the narrative. It's not immense or very radical in the immediate, but it happens. And one of the examples that was mentioned is the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 following the killing of George Floyd by police in the US. Because it demonstrated this, it felt considerable for many to hear mainstream media platforms discussing the disproportionate deaths of Black people in police custody, using words like institutional racism when it came to referring to the police and its historical kind of racism and the targeting of particular communities, and reflecting the pain, rage, and demands of movements from below who've long campaigned on these issues. And this allows us to consider what we want the media landscape to look like in an ideal world, to shape, to discuss, and to develop methods of informing that are inclusive, democratic, publicly owned, and don't peddle the line of right-wing politicians and big business. As is organizing within outlets and institutions that are part of the problem. We cannot assume that all workers within these spaces believe in the content that they're putting out, or even if they did, not all believe that the media serves to push particular political agendas. And I know it's bold to say in this day and age, but some even change their minds. In the UK, there are past examples of the impact of workers organizing and resisting the status quo within the belly of the beast. During the miners' strike, when the Sun tried to print a picture of the National Union of Mine Workers President Arthur Scargill with his arm raised under the headline Mein Führer, the print workers refused to produce the page. So these questions, which extend to our society as a whole, are also points to consider when it comes to culture. So thinking about Ian's points, we know that historically the industry is a sphere of struggle, both as a place of employment as well as a powerful source of representation. The McCarthy era saw popular culture as a source of political threat, so the government sought to actively control it. And as we know, the CIA funded painters, musicians, actors, etc., to both depoliticize the masses as well as push through a particular representation of the US abroad. And this is just one example that points to the very political nature of these cultural institutions, and therefore for the workers within them to know and collectively organize on that basis. Because states continue to fund culture today for their various political objectives, especially given the use of culture in the current war on terror. It shows the potential bridge between movements on the ground that function externally to cultural institutions and those who work within them. A few years ago, it was reported that the British government's counterterrorism propaganda unit was working on youth-targeted campaigns in the Middle East and North Africa. The British Council led work in Tunisia, Morocco, and Lebanon that focused on cultural and artistic platforms to deliver messages about alternative pathways to vulnerable youth. It was called Strengthening Resilience in the MENA. The program worked with national governments of each country in the hope of recruiting local civil society groups and organizations into the project in order to supposedly steer young people away from radicalization and the possible recruitment into terrorist groups. The entire thing was clearly a campaign to strengthen identification with the state and undermine feelings of social revolt and resistance that were rightly brewing. Similar to the methods used by the CIA during the Cold War, hip-hop culture, which included rap and graffiti, was a key component in the strengthening resilience work. What historically served as an art form which speaks to young people from oppressed groups about social consciousness, political frustrations, and state violence was co-opted as a means of strategic communications by repressive states. Finally, I think it's important to note that the hope is not just to win the media narrative or even the media space materially, as I feel many, particularly at this height of the diversity industry, consider this to be the battleground and ultimate demand. It's about changing our society as a whole, and it's through developing networks and coalitions, building strong and loud movements that apply pressure everywhere from below, that we shape the contents of the industries themselves. People do the right thing when there is a mass organized, politicized space that occupies the streets, the classrooms, unions, workplaces, mosques, churches, etc., etc. We develop ideas, we think about the issues that plague our world and consider how we change them by coming together collectively, talking and taking action. It was the national, visible, uncompromising movement led by the striking miners, after all, that gave workers in the media the understanding and confidence to resist the toxic narrative. More recently than the miners is the opposition to the UK government's Prevent agenda. The wide coalition and movement across university campuses, faith spaces, schools, nurseries, healthcares, and art spaces, which, you know, the IHRC was also so central to, reshaped its public image and forced repeated attempts by the government to rebrand it. We must actively present and fight for different social realities in order for them to be represented within the media and cultural realms. A recent example to end on has been the response to Netflix's Farha, a film about a young girl's traumatic experiences during the Nakba, which has been attacked endlessly by Israel and which has led to an international mobilization to defend it. This is only possible because of the resistance of Palestinians to Israel's occupation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malia. Yeah, the issue of Farha has really become a global one. I suspect even for some people who may not necessarily be able to access Netflix, but such as the power and the promise of countering the efforts to silence and cancel and to erase. Ironically, given on the one hand, at least profess Western ideas of freedom of expression, and here efforts being made by those who claim to either be Western or emulating the West, and in fact trying to suppress that. Well, we have a few minutes left, and so I would certainly like to invite any questions that our audience members have, please feel free to convey them via our comments section. Otherwise, I'd like to go ahead and actually ask this question. That it seems that one of the things that binds a lot of the remarks is the idea of agency. I mean, as Daniel had pointed out regarding Lebanon, and certainly something that was also affirmed by Setareh. There's this idea of others trying to explain or to shape the narrative about either Iran or Lebanon, and in many ways really erasing the voices and the representation of those who actually live in these places to be able to then assert themselves. I mean, how many times do we then see on actual media broadcasts those who are purportedly affected and targeted actually having their own voice? It seems as though it's always some Western pundit or analyst doing the explaining of all aspects of that society, complex that these issues are. And certainly, as Malia, you have just mentioned, the idea of building coalition. So how do we then restore agency? And particularly, I'd like to focus on Muslims who are living within the so-called hegemon. How do we then provide for them a set of tools to then claim the agency which they have, for which they have a right, in order to push back on these kinds of forces? I'll invite that a response from anybody. Okay, we have another question here. How central is the genre of the spy novel, the film, or TV series?
I was waiting. Sorry, I was being too polite. I didn't want anybody. I think in some respects, the crucial question of agency there, like, I do think there is a kind of boringly, slightly banal material answer to that. You know, like there are real concrete, as both Lawrence and Malia point out, there are real concrete material obstacles to overcome. And in the UK, we have a situation where you have 8 mainstream newspapers that are owned by billionaires, you know? And I'm sorry, that's not an incredibly sophisticated intellectual point, but it's a kind of banal wall that we run up against again and again. And until we find a way, and they're toxic. They're really toxic. You know, I'm British and working class, or not working class anymore, but I was working class before I became an academic. And like when you talk to people, it's just a completely different conversation. So many people are completely imbibing these discourses. So I do think that agency, I completely agree with the concept of agency. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for empowering people with agency, but there is a kind of neoliberal aspect to the use of the word agency, you know, demanding agency from people in situations where actually the things which are impeding them are massively systemic and have to be addressed at executive levels. It can't just be about empowering people with voices. It's not just that. These are really, to some extent, almost insuperable conditions. So for me, in the UK, which is a depressing scenario, that is one thought that comes to mind. But
okay, Lawrence, how do you see this playing out regarding media? And I think piggybacking on what Ian said, when it comes to a few people, these oligarchs, these billionaires controlling media, we certainly see now the effects of Elon Musk, who has bought Twitter and seems to be engaged in a reign of terror there.
Yeah. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong. I am a Twitter user. There is a little bit of a guilty pleasure in kind of seeing how that plays out, and you know, it's mass exodus of people going to Mastodon, you know, but you know, and the various reports on what Elon Musk is like as a boss. Like I have no knowledge. I don't know the man. I have no comment on that. But you know, yeah, it's an increasingly concentrated industry. But also, you know, Malia mentioned this about different independent organizations coming up and those kind of things. You know, and you know, we have this in all other industries as well, you know. I mean, take something completely unrelated, but, you know, if you think about the fashion brand Armani, right? You have Armani Exchange, you have Armani, Armani makes football wear now, football shirts and trainers, and and all to capture an aspect of the market, right? And to diversify its portfolio away from its luxury clothing brands. And you know, news networks and the oligarchs are the same. It's all about following profits. And if we all tomorrow decided that we weren't gonna, or let's say the audience of Fox News was gonna turn it off and they were gonna watch something else, then we're either moving towards another product owned by the same person, so it probably it makes very little difference to that person, or we'll end up consuming another product that eventually will be bought out by that very billionaire that you try to avoid. So I think like Ian was saying, that there's very systemic problems are the result of concentrated wealth in the hands of very few individuals that also have very little interest other than just garnering more wealth, and the strategies employed are not in a are not employed for the benefit of both the audience and the subject on which they report. It's just garnering more wealth, and that is a deeply problematic systemic problem that we have. The fact that I let's in a very sort of side note during my PhD, which seems like a centuries ago, being that's almost a decade ago now. At one point, I made the comment that I don't Islamic terrorism wouldn't be as popularly consumed if it wasn't as popular. If it was easier to sell suicide bombing um, Buddhist monks from Burma, which is a real fact, right? That would be the trope, right? But it doesn't sell. It's an oxymoron, like it's very confusing, the idea that Burmese Buddhist monks are suicide bombing, Rohingya minorities and others. So it's about what sells, and that's partly to do with this very long historical tradition of Islamophobic discourse and the various things that make that up. And but it yeah, and it when they all combine, it's a very, very powerful mechanism to sell. And the sad fact of it is that I think sometimes, we think it's ideological, but it's really just all about money. The old saying, and not everything is politics. It's not. Sadly, it's not all ideological. It's just the ideological is the mechanism that makes the sales pitch easier, and so it's the most effective mechanism. So why fight it, right? And that's the problem. I think one of the biggest issues is actually making sure that that is not the most effective mechanism. And once and much smarter individuals have offered suggestions for how to do that than I will offer up here. But but I think once that movement does actually start garnering more widespread support, then I think you actually have a fighting chance to make some meaningful difference.
Okay, we have a comment from someone in the audience asking, would having more media in mother tongues help?
I mean, I kind of want to say it already exists in, I don't know who's, you'd have to ask for clarification, I guess, where and whose mother tongues. But I mean, so I'm from the Netherlands, right? We have a guy from the northern Netherlands speak Dutch, and he's subtitled, right? Because the people in the south can't understand his accent, right? Now, I don't think Geordies get subtitled on the BBC, but that's the sort of effect you have, right? So but in the UK, there's a sort of penchant for, depending on which outlet, whether the presenter has a northern accent or is a sort of, public school educated individual. So, what do those mother tongues look like? Is it accents? Is it regional representation? Are we talking about language? Guy Uno has a has an Italian presenter. If you go to France, RDF or ARD in Germany, they have German presenters, so that would be their mother tongue. So I and they get subtitled where necessary. So I don't think that's necessarily the I don't know if that's really an issue so much.
It looks like the question is based on the notion of minoritized settings. I mean, just one thing I'd like to point out is that it can be problematic when you have, for example, Voice of America broadcasting in local languages. Here you then find it deployed not as a sign of recognition or even respect for the community that is being attempted to be reached, but really a vehicle for propaganda. Setareh, I believe you'd like to go ahead and comment on the on it from the standpoint of Farsi.
Yeah, that's exactly the point that I wanted to make. I think it's not the language necessary, although I think maybe having more input in your mother tongue helps, but it's the content and how the content is not invaded by cultural hegemony. Because as you said, for example, in the case of Farsi-speaking media, I think there are plenty of media outlets doing their job in Farsi, in the mother tongue of Iranians, but most of them are just emulating the mainstream media. So I think it has more to do with the content than the language.
I mean, it brings up this interesting question, right, between translation and actual recontextualization. Yes, Lawrence.
Yeah, I just want to add a quick thing on that. The other element is, depending on how that's structured internally, you could end up with two very different companies almost. If you think about Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Jazeera English, they produce very different content, very different ideological splits in a very different audiences for that reason. So I think like what Setareh said, I'm not sure. Language is obviously a very crucial component, but I'm not sure the medium, let's say the language as a medium versus its content is as crucial in how stories and people get represented.
Right. Well, listen, I want to. I'm sorry. It looks like Ian, you have your hand up. Yes.
Can I just briefly jump in on that, because it was one of the frustrations the question of place and the question of language and where the representation actually takes place was one of the frustrations I had following the discussion, really, or the difficulties, because like there's something about I'm sure a documentary on women's rights and abuses in Iran in Farsi on Iranian television is one thing. That same documentary with English subtitles in Kansas City on a Saturday afternoon is something on CBS is something completely different. Do you know what I mean? There's something profoundly changing about these two. And certainly, as someone who works in Qatar, and as someone who feels very strongly about the situation of migrant laborers in Qatar, it's been very frustrating to simultaneously witness on the outside this, as a number of people have suggested, it's not openly racist, medievalizing, orientalist depiction, as though Qatar is the only country in the world where labor gets exploited, right? But then inside Qatar, it's been equally frustrating using that kind of critique, seeing people use to completely close down any conversation about labor. Do you know what I mean? In a very reactionary way. So this is it's almost as if we have two completely separate conversations going on. It's almost a kind of, so yeah, I that's what I wanted to share. Isn't this really two conversations?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Ian, because I remember speaking to a Muslim student who was distraught with the World Cup coverage when one of the Qatari officials was apparently asked in an interview what was his perspective on migrant workers and their deaths. And he apparently said something on the notion of, well, people do die on work sites. And the way that it was depicted in the American media was someone who was brazenly callous, completely insensitive, and acted as though these weren't even human beings, without recognizing that from an anthropological perspective, he could have simply been much more existential, saying, it's God's will, as well as the fact that there are those who need to be reminded of the fact that workplace occupational hazards is actually baked into the cake. Lauren's asking, is that a consequence or extension of identity politics and its wider issues and debates? This is directed toward Ian, Lauren?
Yeah, it was just the thought whereby, I always feel like, any debate that kind of has identity politics into it, it somehow seems to be playing all the sides against each other, and and Twitter is the perfect example, right? Twitter does not foster dialogue. We just end up yelling at each other, giant threads of opinions, and no one actually engages on anything, which is, I think, why it works for Elon Musk and no one else. But it's that sort of thing, and I think Ian hit the nail on the head in his comment, whereby we end up having, just on the same issue, just parallel conversations, and no one ends up actually talking to each other and resolving anything.
Right. Daniel, would you like to add to this, please?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to add to this and also go back to connect to the initial question about the agency, but also to ask a question, to what extent we can construct or even provide spaces for agency without thinking of the structural, but also historical and infrastructural restrictions to media and to spaces. So even before we talk about Twitter, thinking about how colonized the discourse in itself is and how colonized it is on so many levels. So beyond us individually being maybe able to center voices of who are marginalized, who are not being granted their agency. Or going back to the example I had in my paper, the idea of this white journalist trying to deprive the indigenous people that they are writing about of their agency, and then imposing it from a new decontextualized imperial perspective. But then also, I mean, besides these individual moments, also for us to think about media as a form of structural violence. And going back to what someone mentioned about so-called, terrorism, and how this has become something that can be very easily sold. So also thinking about the capitalist component, and something that Jack Shaheen has referred to as repetition as a teaching tool. So if Hollywood, if we just have it as an example, was successful to portray Muslims and people of color as terrorists and dehumanize them, and it has been able to get away with it for a century and to make a lot of money and increase their audiences, why would they not do that anymore? And what kind of backlash would there have to be? So I think it's much more of a problem of structure, but also of the idea of agenda setting. Again, if we think about Iran and the current constructions again of Iran, there is an agenda that has been set. There is a widespread, there are widespread ideas about Iran among people and audiences who have no knowledge and no access to knowledge about Iran. So again, bringing into the questions of capitalism, structure, but also of how colonized the discourse is on many levels.
Right. Okay. So Tara, I'll give you the last word on the panel.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, probably the reactionary response that you get inside one country about the, let's say, human rights abuses or women's rights violations is because, I personally, this is the experience that I have had, and I hear from many other Iranian women, including the ones that have been taking part in the protest, that the intervention and the double standards towards them have made it very, very difficult. I wouldn't want to have a conversation about women's rights inside Iran about anyone from outside, because I think that's a domestic issue, and we have been trying. And that's why I sometimes say, the exaggerated coverage of the things that are going on in Iran and the hegemonic and the Eurocentric notions of women's rights exploited to portray Iran as not normal makes our struggle at Iran a lot more difficult. So I think, I'm not saying this is necessarily a good or bad response, but I think it's a natural response to what people see as double standards, their agency of what changes happen inside ripped off of them, and intervention and double standards are, I think, the main reason that you would probably see those kinds of conversations like dying out before they're actually formed on those topics.
All right. Okay. Well, listen, I'd like to thank all of you for really providing such a robust and vibrant analysis, as well as, of course, this conversation to conclude it. Ian Almond, Denijal Jegic, Lawrence Rooij, Setareh Sadeqi, and Malia Bouattia, who had to leave us a little bit early. Thank you all. Thank you to our audience, and thank you to those in anticipation of those who will be watching this recorded and as an archived version. I'd like to then go ahead and certainly for those panelists who need to leave, I don't want to hold you up. Let me go ahead then and provide, if I may, a little bit of a summary of today's proceedings. We had, of course, our panel this morning, British time, on Muslims at the periphery of the West. What will the shifts bode for them? And we heard a couple of really interesting interventions on this. We heard from Olsi Jayeshi from Albania, talking about the way that Islam, when it has been convenient, has been deployed by the West, in essence, really looking at this through the lens of opportunism. Taking us through a history of the Balkan region, the suppression of Islam due to the Soviet era, and then this moment of opportunity for it to reemerge and to be revived, and how the narrative of Islam was then manipulated and controlled by the kind of external intervention coming in with various actors ambitiously trying to then formulate narratives, whether it was the Saudis with an amplification of a Salafi narrative, or as we find later, even Western sources. The very fact that Islam then moves from being an ally in the Cold War as a bulwark against Soviet communism in places like the Balkans, but then of course in others like Afghanistan is very telling. And the evolution then of Islam from its Cold War manipulation to the post-Cold War era, where it moves from being an ally to an enemy. The very idea that the United States after 9/11 seized the narrative of Islam in the Balkans, as Jayeshi points out, in many ways handing it over to the Gülenist movement, ostensibly to provide a politically quietist or even a politically neutered expression of Islam, so that it does not emerge into a more robust, totalistic, and potentially oppositional force to Western interests and Western designs. We also heard from Jean Silva Jordão, who provided us with a very intriguing thought experiment. What if we find then that there is in fact a realignment away from the very typical and hackneyed binary of East versus West, with the East, of course, being represented in large by the Islamicate. But what about the creation of a northern megastate? The very idea of Europe as already being essentially a federal state, the United States and Canada having come together to form a de facto superstate by treaties, particularly commercial and security interests driving that. And what if we were to add Russia into this mix? And even Jordão conceded that at this point it does not seem very likely, given the West's purported antipathy toward Russia and its current posture regarding the Ukraine. But the idea of a new West, if you will, including Russia, to then form what would be seen as an entente of anti-Islamic positionality is an interesting one to then go ahead and consider. We heard also from Yasser Louati, who responded by examining this triple threat that the West perceives of Muslims, threats to national security, threats to national identity, threats to the national economy, and particularly how it manifests itself in a country like France, and more specifically with the rhetoric of not only Emmanuel Macron, but even people like Mélenchon, and quite obviously the far right. Muslims being seen as part of the periphery, but important to also recognize how they contributed to making Europe what it is today. Certainly that might not be a badge of honor that Muslims want to necessarily carry with them, depending on how they perceive Europe and more broadly the West. If it is a project that is depraved, then I'm sure most people would not necessarily want to take credit for that. But if it is a project of success, then the marginalization of Muslim contribution is also something which is not just benign neglect, recognizing that Europe would not have achieved its success, its power, its domination, and its hegemony were it not through colonization, exploitation, and even slavery, going all the way back to the 15th century. As the saying goes, standing on the shoulders of giants would certainly be an apt one over here. And of course, various projects involving the colonial, the exploitative, and those that involve slavery had a disproportionately high amount of encounter with the Muslim world. Is this then with, as Yasser described, an effort against Islam? Is it a campaign against political Islam? And if it is it really then a fear of Islamism, as it is sometimes referred, or is it really an effort to simply prevent and silence Muslims from being politically active, even if they're not speaking from within an Islamic narrative in doing so? Is the problem for Muslims the fact that they want to politically engage, that they want to participate, especially living in the West, in democratic processes? Or is this an effort to just simply make them go away or be swept under the proverbial rug? Arzu Merali also was inquiring about Islamophobia as a central component of Western foreign policy, and was trying to identify perhaps when did it in fact begin. And it's an intriguing question to go ahead and ask at to what is that origin point, because from that point then, of course, we formulate all kinds of elements of causation, and then also strategies on how to then try to move beyond that step. And it seems as though that timeline could be sent even further and further and further back when it comes to Western forms of Islamophobia, predating 9/11, predating the Cold War, predating even the Iranian Revolution, going back not decades, but in fact centuries. How that then affects both Muslim perceptions of the West, Western perceptions of Muslims and Islam, and then also the self-perception of the West, particularly at times like now, where there are so many shifts abound. The notion of neither the West nor the Islamicate being static is an important factor to consider as we engage in these kinds of discussions and dialogues. The second panel, the second plenary session, Perceptions and Representations of Muslims Within the Hegemon, examined and explored Muslims living in the proverbial belly of the beast, not living in the periphery, not being geographically on the receiving end of the Western shifts and its attitudes and actions. But what about Muslims living within the West, being privy to all of these changes, but facing, one might say, either a different set of challenges or two different kinds of challenges, not just the ones that they're facing domestically, but also being privy to those that their co-religionists are facing in the periphery, living within not a liminal space, but in fact living in two spaces. And a big driver for this, of course, is media representation of Islam and Muslims respectively. And Laurence de Rooij provided a very nice architecture of the various avenues for changes that need to be examined. Too often there is an emphasis almost exclusively on discursive change, but Laurence pointed out that there are at least two other areas that need to be assessed. One is the changing psychological processes of not just the consumers of media, but also the psychological processes of the media outlets themselves. And then also examining along with that is considerations for the organizational changes within the media sphere. These can include compliance, clarification, culture, and connection. All of these then become elements that have to be explored when it comes to media outlets and help better understand what in fact drives them when it comes to the kind of representations and the framing of issues and the framing of entire communities that they might have. We also heard from Ian Almond, who decided to take a look at world literature as being the lens through which understanding then Muslim perceptions, Muslim self-perceptions in the West, and mapping this as having a broader historical arc, where even the term world literature can go back to the 19th century with Goethe, taking a look at how it then develops into a pedagogical phenomenon within the United States in the 20th century, and the whole notion then of what exactly is world lit. It seems that if it is really the whole world, then it would be redundant to in fact even say that, or to seem as though it is an exception to some other norm. But in fact, in very many ways, it is really an exception to the reality. As Ian pointed out, the West is only 10% of the planet, but in fact, it has the majority of or even a monopoly on the space of literature, and world literature then is made to be felt or cast as really a minoritarian position. The number of Nobel Literature laureates, the space within the Norton Anthology, which is an authoritative text on literature, which novels are considered to be among the greatest and forming canons, becomes incredibly important, especially if then these are not just deployments of racism, but those who then are shaping the room, shaping the curricula that Muslims in the West then are experiencing within the classroom. If there is a lack of representation of the non-West, it will skew both the perception as well as the identity of Muslims, and especially young Muslims, who perhaps are more impressionable as they are starting to formulate the window through which they see the world, and in many ways the mirror through which they see themselves. The whole notion that perhaps it is an influence of genre more than even language is really critical. That how do even non-Western writers fall under the influence of particular genres that then infuse and enter their literature, irrespective of which language in which they write. We heard from Denijal Jegic, looking at the Islamophobic and sectarian discourse on representations of Lebanon and Iran. And in many ways, as we're examining this notion of, is the West really changing? Is it feeling anxieties over losing or eroding its influence on the global stage? We find that in some ways it is, in fact, deploying very old tropes and strategies as to how it interacts with the so-called Islamicate. In places like Lebanon, it is still using language of occupation, making the claim that Lebanon is under Iranian occupation, that it is subject to an inauthentic, illegitimate presence of Hezbollah, which is nothing more in its estimation than a proxy for Iran, again, trying to, in many ways, strip the Lebanese of a sense of having agency or self-determination regarding the present and the future of their country. This then, of course, falls into many narratives that we have experienced and witnessed before, whether it is white savior complex, white man's burden, and that way we can ask the question that, is it really so much of a great reset that the West is having, or is this simply a reversion back to the status quo regarding the use of Orientalist and Islamophobic tropes? We heard from Setareh Sadeqi, someone who could speak with authority and legitimacy as to what is the reality of the situation in a place like Iran in the midst of overwhelming media attention when it comes to the recent protests there, examining then the role of gender and ethnicity in shaping these tropes, as well as the demonization of Iran as an irrational actor. A classic Orientalist trope of seeing the Muslims as not only dangerous, but bereft of acting with reason or with rational thought. We also heard from Malia Bouattia, who explored the issue of Muslims living in the Hegemon from the standpoint of response. She points out the response to Farha on Netflix, depicting a Palestinian life, those voices that were in opposition to it, trying to silence it, as well as the response and reaction to those efforts to silence it, taking on global dimensions, not just locally or within a couple of set communities. The need to organize resistance and the ability to reject media narratives is not only something that Malia would advocate, but something that she demonstrated was and could be successful by using the example of print workers in the UK who refused to allow an image with which they objected to go to press. So these are efforts that can win, provided one understand, in her estimation, that winning the media battle is not winning the overall war. It has to be part of a strategy that involves forming coalitions and networks and formulating ideas, because really what is involved is changing civil society as a whole. So again, a very rich day of panels. I'd like to thank you for attending, for being attentive to it, and for those of you who will be joining us through watching the recorded and archived versions, I welcome you to be engaged on that, and certainly invite you not only to return tomorrow for another full day of the conference, but also to remind you that we do in fact have one more plenary session this evening, British time. It will be at 7 p.m. GMT, and it will be on Islam and the concept of a new world civilization. Our speaker will be Sandhu Hira, who is from one of our co-organizers for the conference, the Decolonial International Network. And the chair for this session will be Richard Haley, who is from another of the conference's co-organizers, Scotland Against Criminalizing Committees. So 7 p.m. British Standard Time, or GMT. I invite all of you, wherever you might be in the world, to join us for what will be a wonderful plenary session by Sandhu. We will go on break and adjourn until then. And until then, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for being with us.